Hello, I'm the Reverend Dr. Lisa Bates Froyland. To introduce myself that way is your first clue that I'm speaking in a different voice and demeanor than is my custom. Usually I use a pleasant smile and a soothing voice to tell you I am Lisa, and I serve as pastor at Redeemer Lutheran Church in Milwaukee, Wisconsin. But I had a conversation earlier this week with the man at the heart of this video who confronted, then convicted, then converted me to speak in a bolder way for anyone who cares to hear. That I am the Reverend Doctor stems from a combination of luck and privilege and diligence and determination. Lucky enough to have the physical and mental health and attention span and accepted learning style. Privileged with resources to get through a whole lot of school and to do it without barriers and challenges like racism, serious trauma, or addiction. My clergy status is not recognized or respected by everyone, but by enough people to make a difference, in Redeemer's neighborhood at least. The doctorate is a PhD in rhetoric, the study of persuasion. My graduate education at Indiana University in the early to mid-1990s included attention to what you might call the linguistic equivalent of defense against the dark arts. Communication tricks that lend themselves to fascism, the disintegration of verifiable truth, and in some cases, laying the foundation for genocide. I also learned about crafting messages that unify while respecting difference, rhetoric that is ethically beholden to principles and shared values, communication that resists muddling reality, even when it might be easy or advantageous to do so. David Hallman learned that about my background when we met 2 years ago. Last week, he texted me multiple links to media coverage that featured him speaking out in light of the protests stemming from the most recent spate of violence and ensuing protests. He just sent me the links. I read them all and texted back, celebrating the way his eloquent and wise words were being presented to a national audience. He asked about pulling something together here in Southeast Wisconsin. When we started talking over the phone about what that might be, he suddenly stopped me. Why do you hold back? Why don't you use your voice forcefully, Reverend Doctor? And I responded, no one wants to hear about race matters from a privileged 50-year-old white woman. Nobody wants to hear from me on this. I see my place as doing what I can behind the scenes with my resources and connections to make sure Black and Brown and LGBTQIA+ and young voices are heard. And David said, but the people who are killing us will not listen to us, and we are left wondering where you are in this, really. Where have I been? Well, I do serve one of the exceedingly rare multiracial congregations of the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, the whitest denomination in the country, despite the theology we proclaim and the social statements we publish. My small but mighty congregation knows my heart and where I stand. Yet, as I preside and preach, I generally work gently, lovingly nurturing the better angels of our nature, affirming us all as broken and blessed. I smile a lot, and people say they can feel my genuine love for them. I rarely confront an opposing point of view directly, but work my way between the words that sound like common ground. And I'm not so proud of that today. In the interest of expanding community, I allow for differences in thought and theology, trusting time and the Holy Spirit to move us to a point of mutual respect and love. I have capitulated to being acculturated female, white, and Midwestern. Don't talk long, don't talk loud, don't talk with an edge in your voice or sternness on your face. Be nice. Passive-aggressive is fine, but be nice. Otherwise, you'll turn people off and lose their support. To be honest, I've also held back because I never thought I had a chance of changing avowed white supremacists or angry racists anyway. So why even try? Why even try? Because while I might be ignored or called names like elitist or a liberal bitch, human beings are dying because I swear they are seen as less than human over and over again. Why even try? Because Kenosha. And as you are about to see, white people like me holding back is part of what allows something like Kenosha to happen. And I mean all of it, from the shooting of Jacob Blake to the destruction of downtown, to the peaceful protests, to the appearance of self-appointed and not at all well-regulated militia like young Kyle Rittenhouse. Get your body and mind in a place to watch and listen to public testimony at Kenosha County Board meetings dating back to before President Trump took office.
Supervisor Hallman, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm not exactly sure what it is I should say. I've tried to write about this a couple of times and seem to have come up short. I made a few notes. I might reference those, I might not. What I will say is this. On a personal level, the last couple of months that we've seen from Ferguson, Missouri, to Milwaukee, to New York, to Cleveland, Ohio, have been very difficult for me. They're difficult because I do this job. I love our law enforcement, I support our law enforcement, but at the same time, I do harbor a fairly healthy measure of fear of our law enforcement. It probably doesn't help that I have two friends that represent the Ferguson area in Missouri, one of them being Alderman Antonio French, who was arrested protesting alongside his constituents, and certainly our mutual friend, who tried to submit the petition against the governor of Missouri's chosen prosecutor to the county office and was denied access, State Senator Maria Chappelle. I know those individuals as I know you. And I know the work that they do, and I know the work that we do, and I know a little bit about their communities, and I know ours. And I know there's some similarities and some parallels. And I know that the issue that people of color have with law enforcement is not going to go away overnight, nor will it go away in the immediate future. Martin Luther King Day is around the corner, and then immediately after that is Black History Month. This is not going away. And I'm going to quote another local elected because I don't know if that person would like their name to be mentioned. But we were in conversation about this issue, and that person said to me, if what has happened in other communities happens in Kenosha, it means that we have failed. I agree with that assessment. And so I'm not speaking tonight to pontificate, to be holy. I'm not trying to offer a policy solution. The only thing that I can tell you that at the core, we have to find a way to grapple with, and again, it's not a policy problem, so it will be difficult to do this, is the issue of trust. I used to wonder why African Americans in particular held such affection for the federal government. And one day it dawned on me, because the feds fixed stuff when as a group of American citizens, they went and said, this is what we'd like, and we're told no, they fought to get it. The problem was, one, they should never have had to fight in the first place and should have already had it. But two, is that the laws of the land were as such to deny them. And when you have a popular law, as we all know, and you want to stay elected, you make sure it's enforced. You double down on the enforcement because that increases your poll numbers. So we've historically had this relationship of mistrust. Even when we try to do right as governments, even when law enforcement tries to do right, And even when members of communities of color know that somebody got robbed or stabbed next door, that has to be dealt with in a certain fashion. But the problem is that we have two populations that do not trust one another for legitimate reasons on both sides. I don't know how to fix that. But I do know that if it's not addressed, then this thing that we call community falls apart, and this thing that we call society really doesn't function. It isn't healthy. And I'm old enough to know the difference between trust and blind faith. Trust requires a sense of openness. There may be some healing that has to occur. Blind faith just is like your puppy coming home. Regardless as to what you do, it's going to lick your hand and be happy to see you. Blind faith doesn't hold any weight, nor does it hold us together. So I don't know if that's what I was supposed to say or should have said, or if it was politically correct, but it was honest. So if anyone wants to dialogue about how we do that, this is a great place to start up a working group of 3 or 4 supervisors and smash heads together and see what we come up with. I don't know any communities that have talked about doing that. It seems everybody wants to back away from this for one reason or another, but they're going to find that they can't do that. So we should be smart and be in front of this thing and try to figure out what that means. What does it look like for communities of color and law enforcement to trust each other? Thank you.
Thank you.
Discrimination against African Americans in Kenosha County.
Supervisor Holman, you have the floor.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. As public servants, we endeavor to do good. We endeavor to make it more than just a campaign aspiration. We endeavor to take our best thoughts, ideas, and plans and convert them into actions that change reality for our community. At our very best, that's what we endeavor to do. But when I consider the recent events that have occurred in Ferguson, Madison, Milwaukee, Cleveland, New York, the state of South Carolina, the state of Oklahoma, the city of Los Angeles, and the city of Baltimore, I'm forced to evaluate my home. I'm forced to evaluate Kenosha. And the only way that I can express this, words fail me. To say that I'm heartbroken to come to the conclusion that Kenosha is just as vulnerable is a gross understatement. The failure to address subconscious discrimination on the basis of race is an American failure. And the underlying cause of the shootings of unarmed African Americans is due to the built-in racial bias and racial discrimination in federal, state, and local policies. The communities and states I've mentioned are a living testimony to that fact. Kenosha is no different, and this realization should not give us comfort. It should also not give us an excuse for inaction. So being the fact that we are public servants who strive to do good, who are tasked with the calling to do better, if we're going to respond to that calling, it means that we have to listen to the things that make us uncomfortable and see the things that we wish to turn away from. So there's a few things that in working with all of you that I feel like you need to know about the community that you live in. Because this is not a burden that I intend to carry alone, and nor is it one that I'm going to keep silent about. A few months back, the director of our Kenosha County DCFS came to Human Services Committee, the committee that I'm privileged enough to chair, and mentioned as part of his report, without me asking, that Black children were overrepresented in the foster care system. When I asked him why, after the meeting, the response that I was given is, well, you know there are mental health issues in the African American community. So on my walk home, my first thought was, okay, that may be so, but no more, no less than in any other community. Not all the black folks are crazy. And it is very difficult for me to hear him say that when I have had black mothers who have come to me who have said that they have complied with the demands of the social worker and that the social worker has lied on them in court and has increasingly put more restrictions on them, preventing them from getting their kids back, which means our government is breaking up families, black families, and that should not happen. I've read news stories about black children being reprimanded and suspended from school for having afros and braids. The teachers all seem to claim the same thing: the hair is a distraction. So imagine my outrage in my own home community, where I know the chancellor of UW-Parkside, the president of Gateway, the president of Carthage, the mayor, all of you, and several other people. And a young man who receives a scholarship, who's on a football team, who has braids, black male, holds up his braid and says, quote, "Y'all know these can be a problem in school." Black hair is not a distraction, nor should children be reprimanded for it, certainly not in the community that I live in. That shouldn't happen. Every year we have a community juvenile justice report that's going to be coming up sometime this summer, I believe in July. We have our county judges and community service providers and county staff all in one room to give ourselves a pat on the back. It's a Kenosha County victory lap to say we're doing a great job. And every year I hear our county staff say the exact same thing: children of color are overrepresented in the data set. And we move on like that's normal, like that's okay, like it should be that way, and that we have no responsibility for it when we're the ones running the system. So imagine the depth of my horror when I read a Stanford psychological study of teachers that says that on the basis of names, on the first offense, according to race, the discipline is even. On the second offense, on the basis of race, if your name is Jim, you're not reprimanded that harshly. If your name is Jamal, they quadruple down on the discipline. We control the flow of young people in the school to prison pipeline. We do that. Our $200 million government. That should not happen. All 8 of our county circuit court judges and the DA will tell you, as they've said to me, without me prompting or asking, they'll say there are sentencing disparities between African Americans and white people. So imagine the trauma when I pick up the newspaper and see a black juvenile that's tried as an adult. Granted, the kid committed murder, and I'm not excusing that. But you try him as an adult in a case where a police officer admits on the witness stand in open court that he planted evidence at the scene. How am I supposed to have confidence in my government or my justice system? You really can't. And the statistics nationwide show that children of color are much more likely to be charged as an adult. In the community I live in, that should not happen. Our county board authorizes local, state, and federal money to our sheriff's department to do drug enforcement. And in communities all across the US and in Kenosha, areas that are heavily populated with black and Latino people experience drug raids on the basis of the biased assumption that people of color, namely African American, do more drugs than white people. The federal data doesn't support that. The federal data on drug usage illustrates that the rates of drug usage between virtually all races are the same. But our county board has made no effort to examine where we're doing drug monitoring or enforcement, what's confiscated in those raids, or the demographics of the persons involved. But apparently we care more about the money in the drug forfeiture fund and what's being done with that, but not the actual people. And if you want further detail on that, I would strongly suggest, and I know somebody's getting mad at me for this, Google the Fourth Amendment War on Drugs Forfeiture Fund. And then tell me if you can sleep. Tell me if you're okay taking that vote. Because the vast majority of you voted yes. I have on numerous occasions through this body asked CABA to tell us not just the size of the investment that a business is making in this community, but how many people were hired. How many came from Kenosha? How many were our folks? How many were women? We believe in stable households, realizing that expenditures exceed what people are being paid, that we have to have two parents working to support a family, whether it's two females, two males, whatever the cohabitation arrangement is. How many women were hired? How many were Black or Latino? How many were between the ages of 18 and 35, so that in our community, we can effectively address the issue of young adult employment and brain gain in our community? In other words, we're not like the other 71 counties. We've got 2 colleges, they're producing people with degrees, and they're staying in this community, and they're having difficulty seeking employment. I've asked for this information in email. I went in person to the Finance Committee, and here on the county board floor. It got so bad that as Todd Battle stood over there, I actually said, we are Kenosha County, we have the I-94 in our borders, there is no reason we should have a sign that says welcome sweatshops. Why would I make such a statement? Because as we, the county board, signed over $500,000, million here, $1.5 million to CABA for their operations and the businesses that they recruited to come here, those businesses were using staffing agencies. And those staffing agencies that were doing the hiring for those businesses, if you were Black and you came in and there was someone behind the desk who was Latino, they would tell you the job was closed, because they had given the job to someone who was not a legal citizen, who was then being mistreated in the workplace and not being paid at least the legal minimum wage. So you had an employer doing, dare I use this phrase, a divide and conquer on our own people. But we kept signing over checks. And so when I came to all of you and said this was a problem, we should do something about it, no one backed me up. You looked at the glossy pictures and the magazines that were put in front of you and said, CABA's doing a great job, let's keep this rolling. So I decided the best way to combat that was to have a town hall on employment discrimination. I brought in the US EEOC and the State Department of Wisconsin's Workforce Development Civil Rights Division, because I thought it would be smart to at least empower the people who live in our districts, whether they're Black, Latino, whatever, that if there is an issue of employment discrimination, to understand the tools they had under the law to confront and to actually get justice so they weren't mistreated. On a more personal level, when I moved to this community and had a vehicle that was working consistently, I was subject to weekly traffic stops by the police for no reason. It was so bad that my white friends in college said, we're not going to let you drive anymore. From now on, you're riding with us. I remember in the first year of being on the county board, shortly after we had taken the vote on the expansion of the public safety building, I was detained outside my house for 45 minutes by 2 officers who rolled up as I was getting my mail coming home from work, saying someone was looking for me. I said, anybody who needs to find me knows where I am. They've got my number, they've got my address. I didn't bother to tell them I was a county supervisor because it should be irrelevant. They refused to let me go in and lay down, even though I said I was tired, and decided to radio the station to see who it was that was looking for me. And as I continued to say, I'm tired, if you need me, you know where to find me, I'm not going anywhere, one of the officers out of the pair was insistent that I had a criminal record. And when I stood there very calmly on my porch and told him, you can look, but you won't find anything, he only became more irate. I know there's a number of you that like to eat at a local establishment very near to this building, which, for the purposes of public embarrassment, I will spare them of. Mr. Chairman, you gave me an invite during the first year of your term as chairman to meet and to socialize and to get to know my fellow county colleagues better. I took you up on that offer. I was maybe 5 or 10 minutes behind you, but as I approached the building, the security guard stopped me and asked me, "Do you have a reservation?" I said, "No," and before I could get out, "I'm here with some people from work." He said, "Then you can't go in." But yet I see the cars of my fellow electeds, all of whom who are white and who are much older, who presumably were allowed to enter without the need of being asked whether or not they had a reservation. I did a ride-along with a deputy sheriff a few years back. And as our deputies tend to do, they patrol Kemper Center. We rolled up next to a bunch of kids on bikes, and the deputy asked the kids, he said, "How are you all doing?" And they said, "Good." One boy, who was probably around the age of 12, looked at me sitting in the front passenger seat, looked at the sheriff's deputy, and said, "Shouldn't he be in the back?" So this points to the precise insanity of institutional racism, is that our children have been indoctrinated into thinking that black skin equals criminal. So much so that the boy thought to question the deputy's logic about allowing a young black male to sit in the front passenger seat. Those children become adults. Those adults become everything from janitors to corporate CEOs. Some even become county board supervisors. And I could say more about that, but I'll spare this body further public embarrassment by not going down that rabbit hole unless a circumstance arises where I see fit to make more of that known. Some become department heads. As I recall, I had a meeting with a particular department, again, sparing them the public embarrassment, I won't say the name. I arrived slightly ahead of my scheduled time for the meeting and announced who I was. And they said, "No, you're not a county supervisor." I said, "Yes, I am." They said, "No, you're not." And finally, I looked at the staff and said, "Would I really come to you and claim to be a county supervisor when a good portion of this community doesn't really pay attention to what the county board does?" And I instructed them, I said, "Check the website." They brought it up, they saw the photo, and then they started singing a different tune. "Oh, Supervisor Hallman, we're so glad you're here." So what's my point by telling you all of this? I know all of you quite well. I know my community quite well. I'm heartbroken that my community allows these things to happen. I'm heartbroken that my government allows, enables, and commits these acts. I'm heartbroken that my fellow county supervisors have seemed to be indifferent to this kind of behavior. I want to believe all of you are better than this. I want to believe that my government is better than this. But I have very, very little hope, and it is quickly and routinely being crushed by the weight of the daily reality of what it means to be black in America. All of you are elected officials. You govern with the consent of the governed. That means a relationship must be present, one of trust, communication, understanding, and love. It does not assume inherent discord and chaos, but it does suggest a striving to understand and to be whole, e pluribus unum, which means out of many, one. But the reality is, philosophically, it means to be made whole, listening to all corners, understanding, believing, and moving forward. You take an oath of office where you're sworn to guard against all enemies, foreign and domestic. We all know who the foreign enemy is. The news will make you aware of that. And I suppose if you believe everything you see on the news, then you know who the domestic enemy is because they want you to believe it's me. So by allowing these things to continue by default, you have made government, federal, state, and local the enemy of people of color. And the Supreme Court is very much the enemy as well. It is not just a legislative matter. when I was running for assembly, I met a little girl. She was probably 8, just off of the northeast corner of Lincoln Park, maybe about a block and a half to 2 blocks away. And I told them I was running, and those kids got excited. And I asked them, I said, what do you want to be when you grow up? Little girl was Latina. She said, I want to be a lawyer. And I asked her why. She said, because I want to help people. And I said, well, you know, that's a lot of school. It's very expensive, but I think you can do it. How about you be a judge? We've got 8 judges. We've got a woman leading our judiciary. I don't think we've ever had a person of color on our county judiciary. How about you be the first one? And her eyes got bigger than the tires on your car. That's the future you all proclaim to believe in and work towards. So I have a difficult time justifying how you believe that and allow these things in this community to go on. If you are people who proclaim that the future, that our today is not yesterday and that our tomorrow is not today, that there is a sense of renewal of possibility, then indifference and neutrality are the nail in the coffin that kill that sense of possibility. There's a quote from Desmond Tutu that says, if the elephant has its foot on the tail of the mouse and you say you're neutral, the mouse will not appreciate your neutrality. If you're neutral in situations of injustice, you've chosen the side of the oppressor. So I came to you tonight to say that if you're really serious and that you don't want to see your community have a long, hot summer, a freezing cold winter, and then another long, hot summer, and you don't want it to resemble Ferguson or Madison or Milwaukee or Cleveland or the city of New York or the state of South Carolina, the state of Oklahoma, the city of Los Angeles, or the city of Baltimore, then this community needs to know you're committed. I have about a dozen resolutions. They are meant to be serious fixes to a multifaceted problem. Some of them will be easy votes for you, others will be extremely difficult. And in addition, I'll say this personally, I want something other than just votes, because I've seen things enacted into law where then simply the system just becomes a chameleon and changes itself and allows injustice to perpetuate itself, creating the same outcome. So I want something deeper. So at some point this summer, expect that to drop in your email, and I'll give you a heads up when that's going to occur. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Holland. Okay.
Please state your name and address for the record. You have 5 minutes to speak.
Good evening. David Hallman, 1341 52nd Street. Dear County Board of Supervisors, last week's events in Orlando still have our nation and our community in tragedy, confusion, and perhaps even minor paranoia. As I both attended and watched vigils or prayer services, I noted that there's also still intense pain at the deaths of primarily black men by law enforcement. An emotion I think that is perhaps even more heightened by the recent one-year anniversary of Dylann Roof killing 8 African Americans at Mother Emanuel in South Carolina. All of these tragedies are deeply interwoven on a variety of levels, and I would like to address what action we can take locally as a community to subvert a similar situation, although our populations are somewhat the same and somewhat different. What is obvious and is frightening to me is that the conditions that occurred as precursors to this type of tragedy are equivalent: a lack of legislative protection and non-biased law enforcement. With regard to the Orlando Pulse nightclub shooting, I want to place emphasis on the fact that the majority of the victims are Latino LGBTQIS people, that is to say lesbian, bisexual, gay, transgendered, queer, intersexed, and same gender loving, as well as LGBTQIS Muslim people. Both of these demographics we have as subsets within our own community, and they have the added dimension of religion into the cultural life, which can make being an LGBTQIS person a traumatic experience. As a result, such persons are forced to live a separate social life, unseen and unknown to everyone but the closest of personal friends. Sustaining this second life can oftentimes burden someone with deep inner torment. The academic work in the field of professional psychology speaks directly to this problem, and it coincides very nicely with the conversations that we've had around mental health and crisis intervention training. So, at the core of the struggle is the battle for recognition of the whole person, and we as local policymakers can work to reduce and relieve the kind of suffering I spoke about earlier. The Human Rights Campaign has long been aware of this, and they have developed the Municipal Equality Index, which scores government policy and programs across 5 different areas of their recognition of LGBTQIS people. A perfect score is a 100. We as Kenosha are sitting at a 38. I believe that in terms of preventing these kinds of tragedies, it is certainly in our best interest to look at the the HRC Municipal Equality Index as well as Campaign Zero, because the question at hand for us when we look at mental health and the psychological literature makes it clear is how do we provide care and protection to LGBTQIS people as well as people of color, realizing that what we do and how we do it has effects on the personal safety of all of us. It's clear from the psych literature that internalized bias is destructive to everyone in community. So that is why I'm suggesting both the HRC Municipal Equality Index as well as Campaign Zero as appropriate public policy responses to address those issues. In closing, I've worked with you on the foreclosure crisis, I've worked with you on healthcare, I worked with you early on sustainability, and I enjoyed all of those projects very much. But the one thing that I was thinking about in my house before I came here tonight, in so many different studies, whether it is city and county or Kenosha, they reference as being a key problem is complacency. No one's really ever been able to identify where that complacency exists that prevents us from taking action. I think, from what I have heard and from what I have seen, is many times we treat things as though that's not our problem. Things happen in America, but they don't happen here. And so because we have that thinking, we don't engage. And in some cases, it is to our detriment. In other cases, sometimes ignorance is bliss. I don't think that this is one of those situations, and I think that we can act, and we can act appropriately, and we can do this by January of 2016 or perhaps even mid-March. So I will leave the 3 psych papers that I have referenced. There's a letter on your desk with your district number written on the envelope. The psych papers I spoke about, I will leave with the county clerk for you to view. They will also be delivered to your email inbox tomorrow morning. The other thing I want to let you know is that in the envelope is also a personal letter from me about my experiences living in Kenosha. So you have that to look forward to, and then what I will give you tomorrow morning or tonight, that will be in your email inbox. So it will be the 3 PDFs in your email along with the link for the Campaign Zero and the HRC Municipal Equality Index. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Hellman.
Supervisor comments. Supervisor Hallman, RE District Meeting on Community Violence.
Supervisor Hellman, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. It's been a long day for me and I'm tired, so I'll make it quick. Roughly, I want to say it was a week and a half to 2 weeks before the most recent election that we had this past November. A group of people approached a house, knocked on the door. The person sitting on the porch next door informed those individuals that the person they were looking for was not home. Those folks then decided to leave. They made the decision to come back later and then shoot the next door neighbor for absolutely no legitimate reason whatsoever. As you can imagine, this scared many residents of my district, which is where this occurred. I got wind of this actually through my pastor and felt like it would be a very good idea the night before Election Day to have a town hall. Because when people are scared, the one thing that you do is you do not wait. You address their concern. And I felt like, as a leader, it would be appropriate for me to do so. So there was no press release, which is why you didn't see it in the Kenosha News, you didn't see it elsewhere, because I didn't want it open to all of the general public, and the time frame on it was very tight. So I passed out flyers face to face in district. And as one of the attendees to the town hall told me, she said, "Weren't you afraid that some of the troublemakers might see you?" I looked at her, I said, "I really hope so, because I want them to know. I want them to know that there are people here who are watching, who are willing to stand up and willing to defend, and who think that this is unacceptable." So yes, I hope they did see me and they know that we're paying attention. About 20 people showed up to that town hall. The conversation ranged from transportation to housing, access to jobs, unsupervised youth, the issue of sex offenders, drugs and gangs, and law enforcement. But there were two things that I was impressed by about this, and I just want to share this with you. Is that first, out of those 20 people who attended, they expressed no fear, because I did ask. And second, they were all committed to making it better. Nobody said that they wanted to leave. And this is the piece that really got me. Out of all of the conversations that we had over probably a 2-hour period, especially because we had talked about sex offenders, which a number of them reside in my district, I said to my constituents, I said, no matter who you are, where you've been, and what you've done, even though we may be disgusted and not like it, God knows that's the truth, a person is still entitled to the dignity and respect that the law and the Constitution allows. Madam Chair, my constituents agreed with that. I feel very, very fortunate to have people who are willing to stand up for their neighborhood like that, and think that I am such a person to be able to fight in front of, alongside, and behind them to do that. I want to let all of you know, and I think this is important for your information moving forward, certainly. I shared with the people who were in attendance that in my district, I do have KKK sympathizers. They don't take my literature and they don't like the fact that I show up at their door, but they're a constituent. You knock at everybody's door, that's what you do. I have an establishment in my district that routinely, several times throughout the year, has skinhead music concerts. It's actually not too far from my church. So I shared this with the residents of my district. So I'm sharing this with all of you to say this. I can deal with a lot on my own. In doing this job, I've had swords pulled on me, guns. I'm a survivor of abuse and assault. It takes a lot for me to be frightened. But there's a place where I draw the line, and that's at hate groups. Dealing with KKK sympathizers and skinheads is not a David Hallman responsibility. And as one of the few people of color on this board, I really need those of you sitting in this room to stand up. Because that's not a place where I can be successful in terms of fighting that battle. And there's a number of folks I know that for one reason or another feel very empowered in their hate. I don't want them to act. We've already had Judy Shepard in this community once. Some of you have probably heard of the James Byrd Matthew Shepard Hate Crimes Act. For those of you unfamiliar, James Byrd was a man in Texas that was literally tied to the back of a vehicle and dragged across the state. Matthew Shepard was a white gay man tied to a fence in Laramie, Wyoming, and left to die in the cold. Those incidents are embarrassing for communities. I know that because I talk to leaders in other communities that have had similar things happen. So I'm approaching all of you saying, there's a component of this that I can deal with, but there's a component of this that I can't. And I need all of you to stand up, because it could be me that ends up tied to the back of a pickup truck. It could be one of your loved ones. Maybe you have a niece or a nephew who's in the closet that somebody decides, I just don't like faggots, let's just get rid of them. That's real. That happens. And people will tank their job, they will tank their academic career, whatever it is they have going, to indulge in an act of hatred and violence. So because I have everyone of every stripe and every persuasion and idea living in my district, you're going to see two things. One of them is written, the other one is half written. You're going to see a resolution coming forward saying that we do not condone Islamophobia and violence and hate towards religious minorities. And you're also going to see a resolution asking the U.S. Senate to rescind, or rather to say no to the confirmation of Jeff Sessions as Attorney General for the United States. I really need all of you. I see some of you have checked out. I see some of you are just talking. I'm really serious about this. I have made peace, Madam Chair, with my maker, and I'm fully prepared to go. But a hate group is not how I want to do it. And honestly, honestly, from the way that I know many of you sitting here, I think you're better than to even allow this. So I know, at least I want to believe, that you'll speak out against this. And if you need help on how to do that, I brought with me a couple flyers, not flyers, but a document I put together as a compact on hate and violence. I haven't written the press release to accompany this yet, but one will be forthcoming. You can take it with you, you can sign it on the spot, we can have some conversation about it. But if you want some help as to how to get started to say no to this nonsense so your community doesn't jump off like a powder keg, I'm holding how you can do it. Thank you.
Thank you, Supervisor Hallman. Please state your name and address for the record.
Mary Magdalene Moser, 2106 73rd Street. Good evening. I am here to express my shock and outrage over the historical inaccuracy of one phrase within Agenda Item I-84, the proposed resolution entitled Anti-Muslim Bias Resolution, which states, whereas the history of Islam in the United States began even before its founding, when African Muslims were enslaved and brought to the Americas. I can barely comprehend the grotesque level of ignorance of the history of the world it took to compose that phrase, but I shall try. History must be respected, but to do that, we must acknowledge the facts upon which it is known. The transatlantic slave trade dates from approximately 1650 to 1900, paralleling the dates of the last Islamic caliphate prior to the Islamic State, the Ottoman Empire, which was based in Asia Minor or modern-day Turkey. During the same time period, the Ottoman Empire was attempting to invade, conquer, and enslave Europe to the north, while simultaneously defending itself against a formidable Islamic threat from the east in the form of the powerful Mughal Empire of Persia, Hindustan, and Southeast Asia. These two draining endeavors allowed the Ottomans to overlook rapidly growing dissent within their own empire coming from the resource-poor area known then as now as Dar al-Saud, or the House of Saud, or the 21st century Islamic majority nation state of Saudi Arabia. Prior to its discovery of the vast wealth associated with petroleum, the House of Saud, at the time before the transatlantic slave trade, was one of the poorest resource-lacking areas of the known world. Seizing upon their Ottoman overlords' preoccupation with invasion to the north and defense to the east, the ethnic Arab population sought to invade, conquer, and plunder the vast resources of the African continent to the west. The reason for this was simple. While the Ottomans had conquered and colonized the coastal cities of North Africa, they could not breach the vast arid wasteland of the Sahara Desert. This obstacle to Ottoman conquest presented no such barrier to the vassal kingdom of the House of Saud, who easily crossed the desert to invade and plunder the seemingly limitless resources of sub-Saharan Africa, which leads us back to the supply side of the transatlantic slave trade. The House of Saud, then as now, is an Islamic majority entity governed by the Sharia or Islamic law. Islamic law forbids, under penalty of death, the enslavement of a Muslim by a Muslim. These ethnic Arab Islamic invaders of Africa immediately engaged in the Islamic law-sanctioned hunting and enslaving of black African non-Muslims targeted specifically and solely because they were non-Muslims. The inhuman enslavement of black African non-Muslims was completely controlled on its supply side by ethnic Arab invaders and colonizers throughout the entire history of the transatlantic slave trade in Africa. The largest and longest operating scholarly academic project tracing the origins of the black African victims of the transatlantic slave trade provides mountains of historic documents proving what I have just said. So you don't have to believe me, but I hope you believe the African Studies departments of the University of California at Berkeley, Emory University, and Harvard University, because they are the driving forces behind documenting the history I have just shared with you. There is only one academic entity in the entire world that disputes these historic facts, and that entity is, unsurprisingly, Al-Azhar University in Cairo, dubbed Sunni Islam's most prestigious university, and, wait for it, completely funded by none other than the House of Saud. I cannot even find words to describe the injustice of re-victimizing the 12 million black Africans who were enslaved by invading ethnic Arab colonizers by falsely claiming that the victims represent the religious ideology of those who hunted, enslaved, and sold them like animals. Therefore, and because February is Black History Month, I ask you to reject the proposed anti-Muslim bias resolution. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Any other citizen comments? Please state your name and address for the record.
My name is Jody Mierhoff, and I live at 121 68th Place in Kenosha. I'm here to speak in support of the resolution introduced tonight to condemn hate speech and violence in Kenosha. Hate crimes against Muslim Americans have reached their highest levels since September 11th, according to the ACLU and the Southern Poverty Law Center. These have included assaults and several firebombings against temples and Islamic centers. In 2012, the Sikh temple attack in Wisconsin resulted in the death of 6 worshipers and the wounding of 4 others. Anti-Muslim incidents are at the top of both the ACLU and Southern Poverty Center's list of harassment, far outpacing any other form of hate crime. I brought some charts with me. I don't know if I'm able to share them or not, but on the City of Kenosha website, it states that Kenosha has small-town charm, and it celebrates arts, entertainment, history, heritage, and education. I think we should also celebrate diversity. While Muslim Americans have frequently become the target of hate crimes in our country, they are not alone. On the county website, Mr. Cruiser's welcome statement says that Kenosha is one of the 10 fastest growing counties in the United States. This indicates to me that Kenosha is a leader and that it is proud of its ability to lead. And so I would like to ask you to adopt the resolution as a way to embrace the diversity of our community and to show that you are a leader in condemning violence and hate speech. Thank you.
Thank you. Please state your name and address for the record.
I'm Gina Walkington. I live at 18916 116th Street in Bristol. I am here tonight as a woman, a mother, an advocate, and an ally to speak about the resolution towards the equal application of justice that will be presented before the board tonight. Sorry, I have a little bit of a cold. The role of the Attorney General requires unbiased implementation of the law. One of the most important pieces to this is ensuring the equal protection under the law of vulnerable and often marginalized members of our society. Jeff Sessions has demonstrated on countless occasions that he is unable to separate his personal beliefs and the law. As a woman, I question his lack of commitment to the support of the rights of those who share my gender. In 2013, he voted against the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, which provides a response and support to the victims of domestic violence, sexual assault, date violence, and stalking. He has also shown questionable judgment when it comes to what constitutes sexual assault. As a mother, I question the view held by Jeff Sessions when it comes to children with disabilities. His view of the Individuals with Disabilities Act was that it may be the single most irritating problem for teachers throughout America today. Excuse me. And he also suggested that accommodations for students with disabilities are a big factor in the decline of the civility and discipline in American classrooms. In addition, while serving as Alabama's Attorney General, he fought against an order from an Alabama Circuit Court judge requesting that the state fix the inequitable funding which had been preventing the poorest districts from providing even the basic services to students in need. As an ally to the LGBTQ community, I question his ability to provide this section of our society equal protection under the law. In response to the Supreme Court ruling on gay marriage, he stated that the highest courts had redefined a sacred and ancient institution, continuing on to say, it is not an act of courage, but a supreme arrogance to pretend that the wisdom of 5 judges is greater than all the men and women who have voted on this issue in the 50 states, and the men and women whose convictions have defined the course of Western civilization. He has also opposed the Matthew Shepard Act, which expanded the definition of a hate crime to include motives based on gender, gender identity, sexual orientation, and disability, citing that he didn't believe it was necessary. I am proud of this community that has the foresight to offer the resolution in condemnation of Mr. Sessions' appointment, and I implore each of you to vote yes to adopting this resolution. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other citizen comments? Please state your name and address for the record.
Melissa Carlberg, 2612 73rd Street. Good evening, board and supervisors. I am a mother of 2 young children. I'm also a licensed professional counselor in the state of Wisconsin. I work as a clinical therapist in a mental health outpatient clinic for a local hospital. All day long, I work with individuals and families who suffer from histories of violence and abuse, bullying, poverty, and trauma. Despite never doing anything like this before, I got some childcare so I could come here to tonight to support the resolution that I heard about, put forth condemning violence and hate speech and expressing solidarity with Muslims and all those targeted for their ethnicity, race, and religion, because I am a concerned citizen of Kenosha County and the United States. The Southern Poverty Law Center reported that between November 9th and December 12th of 2016, there were 1,094 bias-related crime incidents. Of this number, 315 incidents were deemed anti-immigrant, 221 anti-black, 112 anti-Muslim, 109 anti-LGBT, 26 anti-Trump, and 6 out of the 26, it should be noted, were also anti-white in nature, and 2 of the 1,094 were anti-white. On November 14th, 2016, NBC News quoted that after a 20-year low of United States hate crime numbers reported in 2014, 2015 saw a marked increase in hate crimes, largely due to a 67% increase in crimes against Muslims, according to an FBI report. In the whole year of 2015, there were 5,850 reported hate crime incidents, 257 which were deemed anti-Muslim hate crimes. Compare this 5,850 number to the 1,094 number of crimes that happened in the 1 month following our election alone. A graduate student in mental health that I know, who is a future colleague of mine, also a resident of the city of Kenosha, who's dark-skinned, a young American man of Filipino descent, told me he was physically assaulted by 2 young men at a gas station at nighttime 1 month ago in the city of Kenosha, and as they were hitting him, they were shouting at him, "Go back to where you came from." I did not get a chance to ask why my acquaintance did not report or press charges. In 2016, there were 26 murders of transgender people in the United States, making it the deadliest year on record for trans people. Almost all of these victims were also people of color. Crimes targeting Sikhs have also apparently escalated since 9/11. We know that the 6 people were murdered and 4 wounded by a white supremacist in the Oak Creek Sikh Temple massacre in 2012. In Wisconsin statistics, according to the FBI database on hate crimes in 2014, Wisconsin had 51 reported hate crimes, 28 of which were race-based, 9 targeted on an individual's sexual orientation, 6 religious-based, 5 due to an individual's ethnicity, and 3 motivated by an individual's disability. 11 of these incidences occurred in Milwaukee, and no data is available yet for 2015 and 16. Advocates from the Wisconsin Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights said the FBI number that I just mentioned is likely inaccurately low, and that the vast majority of hate crimes go unreported. Victims aren't willing to report their crimes due to fear of exposure, retaliation, or increased attention, especially with regard to sexual orientation or gender identity. Law enforcement doesn't take their complaints seriously. The bias apparently underlying hate crimes is often difficult, if not impossible, to prove in court. Reggie Jackson, board chair of Americans Black Holocaust Museum, has testified that looking at larger data sets show that just 1 in 35 hate crimes is reported as such. Well, many of you may be aware that Wisconsin has a hate crime law in the form of a penalty enhancer, which protects those who intentionally are targeted for a crime based on their race, religion, color, disability, sexual orientation, national origin, or ancestry. This penalty enhancer is only applied after going before a jury and being proven beyond a reasonable doubt that the crime's motivation was bias-related. The Wisconsin law also does not cover crimes motivated by gender, gender identity, age, or political affiliation, according to the data compiled by the Anti-Defamation League, nor does the state mandate law enforcement training on hate crimes. Even federal law covers crimes motivated by race, religion, national origin, but it does not include sexual orientation, gender, gender identity, or disability. For all these reasons, it appears to me that national as well as local violence directed toward individuals on the basis of bias will continue to be a problem that necessitates our attention and concern. Kenosha County is a diverse county made up of a wide array of races, ethnicities, ability levels, religions, and sexual orientations. Regardless of any partisan-based policy or political orientation, I ask you, does Kenosha County stand against bias-based violence, or does it remain silent, condoning the status quo of rising hate crimes numbers?
Please wrap up your comments.
I ask that you consider your position on these questions as you consider approving this resolution, and I would advocate that Kenosha County stands for the safety and peace of all its citizens, and that acceptance of this resolution helps to provide a foundation that greater work toward establishing this safety and peace can happen. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other citizen comments? Please state your name and address for the record. You'll have 5 minutes to speak.
My name is Christine Reardon. I live at 1112 58th Street. County Supervisors, Madam Chairwoman, Executive Cruiser, thank you for allowing me to speak. This past April, Supervisor Hallman brought a resolution to the Executive Committee of the County Board condemning racism and discrimination within our community. The resolution set out to be a statement of solidarity of opinion, holding the board to no further action beyond its passage. The board proved unwilling to take even this small step, and it died in committee. That was the day I decided to leave in Kenosha. I do not want my future tied to a community that shows so little regard for my experience or the experiences of my friends and neighbors. However, I will be here another 4 years. I know some of you, and I know you to be people of goodwill. Today, I am here to make you aware of what you are turning a blind eye to and to give you a chance to convince me that this community supports diversity. I am part of a mixed race family. We see more sides of racism than most people. During the fall semester, my daughter was verbally assaulted on her way to school by strangers, yelling at her to go back to Mexico. You see, perception is more important than reality to racists, and the perpetrators believed she was Mexican. I am not upset by the misperception. I am upset that any child, regardless of background, can be harassed by adults who don't even know them while they are walking to school. I don't understand why the county board doesn't see the need to speak out against this kind of behavior. This has been happening across our country for a long time now. Last month, 2 men in Portland, Oregon were murdered. They were standing up for 2 women suffering an assault similar to my daughter's. Kenosha is not immune to the sickness sweeping our nation. While walking along the lakefront, my son, who is light-skinned and blue-eyed, was approached by men who tried to recruit him into a Klan-affiliated militia. After a period of decline, hate group membership is on the rise again, and they feel emboldened to approach our children on our streets and in our parks. As the elected representatives of this community, your silence contributes to their empowerment. We all know the saying, the only thing needed for evil to win is for good people to do nothing. I believe you to be good people. I urge you to reconsider Supervisor Holman's resolution and to cease your silence in the face of the racism that is increasingly prevalent within Kenosha. My fellow Kenoshans, I ask you to stand with me in asking our county board why they are indifferent to racism in our community, especially Kimberly Brunig, Daniel Esposito, Terry Rose, Michael Gable, Aaron Decker, Leah Blau, Dennis Elverman, and Boyd Frederick, the members of the executive committee who chose not to bring the resolution before the entire county board. Thank you.
Thank you.
At the end of the clips, David Holman, now founding director of the Black String Triage Ensemble, reflects on why Kenosha happened.
Some of it will be easy for me to share, some of it will be difficult. But I think I've selected 7 things that stand out in my mind strongly that speak to the reason as to why Kenosha happened. Now, these 7 things are not the only items, but as far as my ability to categorize them in a way where they could be understood and easily digested for people who are unfamiliar, these are the 7 that I've chosen. So how did Kenosha happen? One of the things that stands out in my mind is the dishonesty about the history. Every year, the United Auto Workers would gather together and celebrate the integration of the assembly line by having a dinner. And the Chrysler plant is no more. The plant is closed up and gone. The site is undergoing environmental remediation. But those members of the UAW that are still alive and still live in that community, they meet, and they would meet for this dinner. And so one year I went as an elected person, and I saw all these faces, these black faces I'd never ever seen before. And I just asked people, I said, so where do you live? Racine. I asked the next black person, where do you live? Racine. I asked someone else, where do you live? Racine. And I couldn't quite figure out why. Why are there so many black folks at this dinner that clearly worked at Chrysler, but they lived in Racine? I checked the census data, tried to get an understanding as to why it is Kenosha didn't have a significant population of black and brown people until almost 1980. Something that's odd when Chicago, just to the south of it, was firmly established with black and brown folks in 1920, and Milwaukee, north of Kenosha, established with black and brown folks somewhere, we'll say, circa 1950. How did Kenosha get skipped? Why did people show up so late? And it wasn't until the superintendent of schools at the time, a white man, very much about social and racial justice, told me, he said, David, we took black people to the border where Kenosha meets Racine and said, get out. If that isn't a stunning detail to learn, it's only intensified by the fact that as a young black person in public office, I was surrounded by people who knew me, who knew my work, who knew my personality, who knew what I stood for. Many of them weren't around when this occurred, and yet no one ever bothered to share that information with me. I had to find out, in seemingly to me, what might have been the worst way possible. It's a little known secret, or perhaps maybe even an open secret, that the area in southeast Wisconsin and northern Illinois is known as the Skinhead Triangle, being Kenosha, Antioch, Waukegan. Kenosha is a city and county that for a very long time has harbored pockets of white supremacists. There was a bar in the middle of a neighborhood of people of color that would routinely bring in punk bands. Some of those punk bands are white supremacist punk bands. And I remember walking the streets down 60th Street, slightly confused as to why there was this crowd of young white people that really didn't look very friendly. There's a bar in downtown Kenosha. A friend of mine's a piano player who enjoys his beverage, and I went to go retrieve him from that bar. He was hanging out with a friend of his, someone I'd never really met before. But as I walked in the door, the person working behind the counter, who was wiping a glass, looked up at me in a strange way, and I heard one of the bar patrons say, "We don't want his kind in here." And the person behind the bar said, "Don't worry, he's not staying very long." What's odd about this is not just that such a place exists, but that it exists in downtown, a place where tourists come, a place where people spend money, a place that would identify itself as being inclusive and, dare I say, progressive. But yet, this community knows that this place is here, knows that it has these people, and is perfectly comfortable and willing to accept allowing it to exist. That's a recipe for disaster in multiple ways. How did Kenosha happen? It was not uncommon when I was there in public office between the years of 2008 and 2018 to see riding right through the center of my district pickup trucks and cars openly displaying the Confederate flag, riding up and down the street. That may not seem like anything significant, but the reality of it is, for people of color, that's an act of racial intimidation. It is saying deliberately and openly and loudly, you are subservient, you have no place here, we do not want you, this is ours. Why else would someone have Confederate flags this far north of the South in the state of Wisconsin? The Dairyland was never part of the Confederacy. What other purpose, what other message would a person be trying to send other than that one? How else did Kenosha happen? Political leadership, both city and county, have never viewed people of color as being constituents. We were fortunate enough that our library brought in Brian Stevenson, director of the Equal Justice Initiative, and I asked him about this question, that is there a need for local politicians to view people of color as being constituents? What does that mean? If you're someone's constituent, it doesn't matter your political affiliation. It doesn't matter how much money you do or don't have. It doesn't matter what your academic background is, whether you went to college, whether you didn't, whether you graduated high school, whether you didn't. None of that matters. A constituent is a living human being with hopes, dreams, ideas, aspirations, plans, goals, fears, concerns. Those that someone in public office, regardless as to how they identify politically, needs to be able to listen to, speak to, hear, try to understand, and begin to work on. When people in public office cease to do that, they cease to view you as a constituent. I would probably even go so far as to say, when you don't view someone as a constituent in this nation of the United States, you violated the Constitution. It's not just about an oath against all enemies, foreign and domestic. It's about working with the people around you to secure a better country. And when you cease to value them, when you ignore the fact that they're being discriminated against in terms of trying to seek jobs, when you ignore the fact that they don't have access to fresh food, when you ignore the fact that they can't afford utilities, when solar is something that can easily be made available, or wind turbines, when you cease to work with people to find solutions, when you neglect them, then they're no longer constituents. You've relegated them not just to being a second-class citizen, but you've basically robbed them of being a citizen at all. How did Kenosha happen? Lazy political leadership. What does lazy political leadership mean? Lazy political leadership means that in the case of the county of Kenosha, in the wake of Ferguson, when communities all across the United States were saying no to federal property from the 1033 program, military-grade equipment that local law enforcement would not be trained to use, but was made available to them. Why does your police department need that? For what purpose? In terms of the county executive of Kenosha, the sheriff of Kenosha, David Beth, and the Kenosha County Board, they went all in. They didn't care. It would have been more difficult for them as leaders to say no, to say, nah, we understand the federal government wants to give us surplus military goods and equipment and give it to us without providing any training. But maybe we should work with our county sheriff. Maybe we should work with our city police because they don't need to have that. We don't need to deploy our law enforcement against our own constituents. I remember speaking to the mayor of Kenosha in the wake of Ferguson about the question of nickel and diming the people of Kenosha. One of the things that came up in the federal report regarding Ferguson was that it was a community that was issuing excessive fines and fees on poor people, and the government was pocketing the money. And I asked him, I said, so what about Kenosha? Have you looked at the city operations? And he said to me, he said, oh, I've asked our city clerk. We've looked at it. We don't have that problem. Okay. I'm not dumb enough to take anybody's word for it. This is government. I believe it when I see it on paper. Was I presented with any kind of documentation, any kind of PDF, any kind of study on the inner workings of the fines and fees of Kenosha and who we were collecting them from? No. That didn't happen. In terms of the county operates the human services, which includes child welfare. I repeatedly got reports from residents in Kenosha, from Black and brown mothers, that they would comply with every demand, every request, and jump through hoops and hurdles put in front of them from social workers in order to get their kids back. But every year, I would hear the same thing out of our human services staff when they would get together for the Justice Summit, reviewing the data and statistics around child welfare. Children of color are overrepresented in the data. Everybody acted like that was something that was supposed to be, like it was perfectly fine. But here's the kicker. When you're elected to serve. And when you serve, that means you have an understanding that you have the capacity and the power to do something and to make a change. So to hear that line, children of color are overrepresented in the data, by our human services staff in Kenosha County government, no, that's not acceptable. You have a job to do to dig into that and to turn it around. Nobody felt the need. Nobody saw it as an obligation. Nobody saw it as a responsibility. How did Kenosha happen? One of the things that always amazed me was by how many people in public life had connections to people in the community, not just any kind of connection, deep connections, going back years and years and years. I recall one evening after a county board meeting, the person who was the chair at the time invited me to a social function after the meeting, to a steakhouse not too far from the county administration building. And I looked at him and I said, I'll be along in a minute. I've got some things to finish up. So I finished up what I was doing in the county administration building and then walked over to the steakhouse where they were. And as I walked up to the door, the person who was working security stopped me and asked me if I had a reservation. And I said, no. And before I could finish, he said, then you can't come in. Okay, but my county colleagues, all of whom are white, they didn't have a reservation. They don't need to make a reservation. They just go wherever they want to go when they want to go there. So I had two options. I could either argue with the man, which probably would not have ended well, or I could just turn around and go the 3 or 4 blocks home, which is what I chose to do. I went home. It was probably a good year to a year and a half before I even bothered to try to set foot in that place. But when I made the person who was the county board chair aware of what had happened, somebody who had a super tight relationship with the owner of the establishment, he gave me the same look all the other folks in public office gave me when it was anything race related. A blank, cold stare. I guess you can be living and have the soul vacate the body. That must be what it looks like. I had learned from a friend of mine who lived not too far down the street from that steakhouse that the owner of the establishment, again, who was friends with the person who was the county board chair, the owner of the establishment had deliberately directed the personnel that he hired as security to stop any black people from entering that establishment. As the establishment owner, he was mean and hostile to the children of color that would play in the street of that neighborhood. My friend's biracial. Her children are biracial. She told me, she said, David, don't ever set foot in that place again. They don't like us, and they don't like this neighborhood. To make this even more stunning, this same establishment is a place that the Kenosha County Democratic Party would go and have fundraisers. That's a lot. That's a lot. Kenosha happens because people don't check their friends. When you let your friends be racist, this is what happens. How did Kenosha happen? How did Kenosha happen? Kenosha happened because there was blatant ignorance and disregard for young people. And when I say young people, I was elected at the age of 23, and when I left, I was 33. I don't necessarily mean myself. When I first got elected to the Kenosha County Board, we had gotten data and reports from our UW Extension staff telling us that young people in Kenosha felt like they had no place, that young people in Kenosha felt that they weren't being listened to, that young people in Kenosha felt that they were not valued, that young people in Kenosha felt that they were not wanted. I would say minimal progress was made, and I shudder even to say the word progress. True, the Youth and Governance program exists, where 2 high schoolers sit on county board committees and get a non-binding vote. Yes, that is true. That is a good thing. That is something that does exist. But it shouldn't have stopped there. It shouldn't have stopped there. there was a brief period on the city side of the house where the mayor seemed like he cared. He went to the director of the public library and he said, I noticed that the events you have in the summer in the park, there's never any violence. What can we do to replicate that, to make it bigger? So she sought out people in the community, and I was one of them, as were a handful of others, to try to brainstorm and create something that would speak to young people, but particularly young people of color. And that team met, they had discussions, they had just gotten to the place where they had decided what needed to happen, and the mayor said, this is no longer a priority. I'm not interested. Thanks for your work. And we were all dismissed. I knew, as a relatively young person, at this point in my early 30s, I knew that if you were a senior citizen, you were being engaged by your local government. If you were a homeowner, you were being engaged by your local government. If you were any kind of professional, white-collar person, if you were clergy, you were being engaged by your government. But if you were underneath the age of 25, God help you, because you were just invisible. And I could sense and feel the disappointment and the rage in my own situation living there. And I knew that if I felt like that, people younger than me probably felt it 10 times as much. So, what do you do in public office when that's the situation? One of the great powers that you have is the power to convene, the power to bring people together, to discuss issues, to try to find solutions, to try to create new pathways forward. So, I worked with some young folks and formed a group, the Kenosha Young Progressive Coalition. People who today are on the forefront of peacefully working on racial justice in Kenosha, and I'm so proud of them. They're my heroes. I brought them together and I said to them, listen, I'm not here to tell you what to do. I'm here to listen to what you're concerned about, give you some insight as to what city and county government are working on, and you're going to use my credibility in public office to change whatever it is that you want, whether it's county government, whether it's city government, whether it's the school board. We will go wherever it is that you want to go and fix what you want fixed. That group of young people ranged in age from as low as 14 and about as high as 25. There were probably somewhere in the neighborhood of about 30 or 40 of them. And these are conversations that we would have weekly on the second floor of an art gallery in Kenosha. They created a manifesto of sorts, a statement of belief. I remember putting together the Google Doc. I didn't add any language. I sat there and watched as they talked about their thoughts on violence, on guns, on race, on LGBTQIS people, on the environment, the things they were concerned about. And when it was all said and done, one of the first things they wanted to tackle was making Kenosha better for trans folks. And we went to the school board and they said, this is what we want. It was amazing to me to see how cruel, how lazy and blatantly cold even the school district was in terms of listening to their voice. When the riots broke out in Kenosha in late August, in the wake of the shooting with Jacob Blake, I was on the ground that Monday with the Black String Triage Ensemble. I looked around Civic Center Park. Some of those were folks that were from Kenosha, others were people from the surrounding area. But one thing was abundantly clear. The age of the people I saw in that park, the age of the people I saw in that park, roughly the same age of the folks that were in KYPC before I left. Their generational peers had come as reinforcements. The only difference was there was nobody with the title of county board supervisor. There was nobody with the title of alderperson. There was no title of mayor. There was nobody with the title of county executive that bothered to speak to them. I tried to get the county executive of Kenosha to meet with the folks in KYPC. A person I affectionately for many years called Chief. I said, Chief, these kids they're angry. They've got local issues that they want heard. You should come and just listen. And I'll never forget his response. I go to the Little League games. I go to the Boy Scout events. And I looked at him very irritated and said, you really think that's enough? I don't understand people in public office that disregard young people. We have this expectation that they're going to go to school, that they're going to get jobs, that they're going to buy homes, that they're going to be part of the community, part of the society, help us figure out what we don't understand and help move us forward. If that's the case, then from the cradle, we have to value them and realize that they're just as much of our boss as the person that has the $350,000 home. Kenosha happened because it chose not to care about the young people. One of the things that I remember, I think it was a Carthage professor in the group that the director of the library had put together shortly before we were dismissed by the mayor for our service, before the mayor lost interest. That Carthage professor said, if you build the village without the young people, they will work to burn it down. Somewhere there's a county board meeting where I quoted that to the county board supervisors. If you build the village without the young people, they will work to burn it down. It seems like that's exactly what happened. How did Kenosha happen? As an LGBTQ person, LGBTQIS, lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgendered, intersex, same gender loving, queer, questioning, we have a rule for the people that are our allies. If somebody does or says something homophobic or transphobic, we expect you to stand up. We expect you to speak out. If you don't, we will take your ally card, rip it up in front of you, and burn it. We have the expectation that you will be just as angry and just as forceful of a defense about protecting our lives as we are about ourselves. Knowing that in turn, we'll defend our straight allies. It's a compact that we make with one another. Why do I raise this in terms of Kenosha? Well, in some ways, it isn't just a Kenosha problem, but a national problem. As people of color, we don't have good rules and standards for the white folks that say that they're our allies. You can go out right now and get a Black Lives Matter yard sign, put it in front of your house, and you're under no obligation to read Ta-Nehisi Coates' Between the World and Me, or Michelle Alexander's New Jim Crow, or even read the poetic works of Amiri Baraka. You can put the sign in front of your house and do absolutely nothing. Why do I raise this in terms of Kenosha? Because for the people in public office who identify as Democrat or liberal or progressive, not to bash folks' political parties, but it seems those are the folks that are the first ones to show up to the NAACP Freedom Fund dinner, not just for the food, but because it comes with a year-long membership to the Kenosha NAACP. I say that because it doesn't matter whether it's a microaggression or systemic racism. One would hope, as a person of color, that the white folks that have NAACP cards would want to do something. But in the case of Kenosha, they don't. They don't. And I guess what confuses me is I would want to know, isn't that the reason that you decided to get an NAACP card? Isn't that the reason why you sought the organization out, was so that people knew you were down for the fight? I was so angry. There's a video somewhere of a county board meeting where I actually said out loud, on the record, do the honorable thing. Bring your NAACP card to the next Kenosha County Board meeting, and I'll bring a small shredder that I have from my house. Since you having the NAACP card obviously isn't doing anyone any good, do the honorable thing, bring it to the meeting, and I'll shred it. There's no shame in that. I just want you to be honest. Places like Kenosha happen because people refuse to be allies, because people refuse to stand up. Or dare I say, people want to play pretend. And in this environment of America, we can't afford pretenders because the real haters are out there. Either you want to do something and have a country where all voices are heard like a choir, where in some cases they blend together, in other cases they are dissonant, but they're still present. You still hear them. You still seek to work through those moments of the music to try to understand, to be a whole nation, to be a complete tapestry. Either that's what you want and you work to get it, or you don't. And it disintegrates and falls apart. That is why places like Kenosha happen. That, and for all the other things that I have said to you, are why places like Kenosha across the United States explode. And for the people who are caught up in the burning buildings and the rioters and the looting, stop it. Stop it. Because you're eclipsing the underlying cause. You are forgetting and ignoring what gives rise to that happening. And we can't afford that kind of ignorance. None of us can. None of us can.
Here I stand. I won't not hear another white person saying something blatantly racist. I'll say, that's not acceptable. You're talking about people I love. I won't write racist people off, as I have done many times. I've even calculated that when a certain generation dies off, most lingering racism will die with them. And that's a convenient untruth, obviously. Racism is filtering down. I can't assume that since most people think it's wrong, I don't need to say anything about it. I think perhaps people who are not white are so accustomed to being grouped that they don't grasp how individualistically we construe our identity. Growing up in my nearly all-white small town in central Minnesota, it was abundantly clear that while we shared the same skin tone and our ancestors largely came from the same European soils, we differed a lot. People of color are calling on white folks like me to check my fellow whites, and many of us are utterly confused about what that means. But it's the work. No more duck and cover, though what comes back might be really nasty. In 9 years of ministry on this corner of 19th and Wisconsin Avenue, the only verbal abuse or threats of violence I've been subjected to have come from white people. I won't delude myself or others into thinking that the constant terror Black, brown, LGBTQI plus immigrants or religious minorities live with in this country every day is not so much my problem. It is a white problem too. How can I say one nation under God, indivisible, when that clearly isn't true right now? With liberty and justice for all, when it has ever been true? I need to be in the fight for that, and not just quietly, craftily, and smilingly behind the scenes. I condemn all violence, from destruction of property to desecration of human life. I affirm nonviolent protest, and I celebrate civil discourse. I want law and order. I want the law to protect all persons from being denied their constitutional right to due process. I think it's been bad policy to make police officers have to function as social workers and emergency psychiatrists, and it's fundamentally wrong for them to function as judge, jury, and executioner. Thankfully, this toxic line of reason is finally being questioned. Unarmed Black man killed by the police, well, what did he do? Have a record, disrespect an officer, try to run away, keep moving after being tased, keep trying to breathe while being restrained? What merits instant execution? And when an officer chokes, to use that truly horrible word of our 45th president, the law must act swiftly. I crave order too, and I feel much less safe as armed militias organize online and now appear in person, in groups, empowered by the gun in their hands and the encouragement of dark arts rhetoric. I support reasonable police reform. Police officers must be paid well, screened well, supported in their difficult work with sensitivity to what they encounter day after day, and they must be well trained, repeatedly, in proven tactics of de-escalation. And before you jump on me about that last point, let me tell you, I know de-escalation works because in my ministry, I have disarmed a person with a knife and accompanied several a yelling and cursing and flailing person out of a tense situation to safety and peace for all of us. Gentle ways are good for some things, after all. And when it comes to my participation in the institutional church, I'll push the ELCA to realize that most of us have to change, open up, ready ourselves for real relationship before we have a prayer of becoming less white as a body of Christ. Our perfect liturgy isn't so perfect. Our hymns could and should stand alongside music we white folks are not so good at singing. And we all need to wake up to the realization that liturgy and hymns are just the trappings of church, not church itself. Church is sacrificial agape love, communities seeking after justice, communal striving for the beloved community. Please know, ELCA, there are different ways of doing everything in the church, including governance. Let's choose our real priorities and act accordingly. White Lutherans in the ELCA have begun naming complicity in racism, heterosexism, and other divisive and oppressive isms, lamenting, repenting, pledging to educate and change, leaning on God for transformation. That's a step, but let's not get comfortable there either. Let's not make an idol of acknowledging fault and basking in shame, because to do so still leaves those who are suffering on the front lines, burdened with convincing their oppressors to change their ways. And I know many of us have been to the protests, holding the signs, marching side by side. That's great. In addition, I've come to think that a big part of the work is conversation with the white people we know, live next to, work with, who are raising kids in troubled times, who have access to all kinds of things. Perhaps you just can't confront for whatever reason. But this white 50-year-old Reverend Doctor can and will. I invite the hatred and disgust of white people who disagree with how I understand the dream of America. Hate on me, who's demanding that you stop hurting and killing people who differ from you. I don't know what motivates you, what happened to you, but it's wrong for you to project that on others who are not even in your life. But I will not hate back. Never. My faith and my allegiance to Jesus Christ will not allow it. But I will speak in this stronger voice because Kenosha happened, and it didn't have to be that way. My passion is principled, but of course it is personal too. The children of my womb are female and white. The children of my congregation, specifically my current confirmands, are male and black. They are precious, thoughtful, and faithful. The present and the future depend on them, and I fear for them. And for those wonderful boys, I speak out today. As the Apostle Paul wrote to the Ephesians in chapter 4, speaking the truth in love, we will grow to become in every respect the mature body of the one who is the head, that is, Christ. David spoke the truth in love to me last week, and this has been my response. Peace be with you, among you, and within you. Amen.